Welcome to Lecture 12 in our series English Thought and Culture. Again, my name's Jake Organ, and we're sort of coming to the end of our course. We've got obviously Lecture 13 and 14, but this is the second part of a two-part series on the British Empire and some of the literature around the British Empire. Okay, the title of this lecture, Lecture 12, is Europeans in Africa, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Okay, this is the English Thought and Culture. This is my name, and this is how you can contact me. Again, before we look at the lecture, let's look at the British Empire. You know, when I say this as a British person, I do feel a certain pride. I'm very prepared to talk about and discuss the negative things that Britain has done in the world, but there's a certain amount of pride of some of the positive things. And the fact that we did something, you know. Many nations have tried to build empires, but we built the largest empire in human history. These are my forefathers. The blood of the men that did that runs in my veins as a British person, and there is a certain amount of pride in that. Maybe you can feel that as I talk about it, but at the same time I want to be balanced in terms of the good and the bad. So the British Empire was the largest empire in history. It by 1922 ruled over a fifth of the world's population. The empire covered a quarter of the world's land surface. Like to go across Britain by car would take you the same amount of time that it took you to go from maybe Riyadh to Taif. You know, it's a very small country, Britain, but it ruled over the quarter of the world's land surface. It started up as a trading empire, but developed a system of military conquest, settling and colonialism. It had both positive and negative effects on its colonies, but it left a legacy of education and social stability in many of its colonies. Okay, and what about Africa? We've looked at India, and India, especially when you talk to Indian people, often they will have very positive memories of the British presence, and they'll have a generally positive view of the Britain's role in India. Generally, you know, 90% of people you meet will have a positive view of what the British left in India. In Africa, it is slightly different. It tends to be seen as more negative, if I'm honest. So let's have a look at some of the facts. As early as 1530, English merchant adventurers started trading in West Africa. So there's some romantic stories of people just getting on a ship and going to lands where they didn't know what was there, and going and making a fortune, trying to do some trade. And this started about 1530. In 1581, Francis Drake, and we talked about him briefly when we talked about the Elizabethan era, reached the Cape of Good Hope, which is basically the bottom point in Africa. You know, South Africa, where you can go then up the east coast of Africa This was reached by Francis Drake in 1581. In 1663, the English built Fort James, and James would have been the king at that time, in Gambia. So that's in the sort of southern part, the western part of Africa, Gambia, I think. Yeah. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, Britain and other European powers like the Portuguese and French were interested in establishing coastal bases to exploit the slave trade. So they weren't interested in really going into Africa, into the interior, and getting things. They were interested in having strong bases on the coast from where they could economically exploit the different trades in Africa, mainly the slave trade, which we'll look at in a minute. So that was a sort of the beginning of the African empires, and in the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa, which was basically a race between different European powers, led to many Europeans competing to build African empires. So Britain competed with Germany, France and Italy over leadership of different colonies. Basically, Britain was trying to create a north-south passage which would all be British, and Germany was trying to create a big east-west passage that would all be German. And that was very much about exploiting the natural resources of the interior of Africa. So let's look at this whole area of the slave trade. We've looked at it in terms of America and where the slaves got to, but where did they come from? So basically the Atlantic slave trade, basically the buying of slaves in Africa and transporting them across the Atlantic to the Americas, went on between the late 16th century and the early 19th century. African slaves were bought from African slavers, Africans who had gone and enslaved other Africans, and they were taken by ship to be domestic servants or, more often, agricultural labourers in the Caribbean, places like St. Kitts, Jamaica, Bermuda, North America or South America. Remember we talked about the United States of America and its big slave population, but also in places like Brazil and Colombia, there's Cuba. There was vast amounts of African slaves, and in the Caribbean. So it's said between 1.2 million and 2.4 million died on the journey across the Atlantic. It was said that around 12 million slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. 12 million, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people now, but in those days that was a big chunk of the population of Africa. This is a significant amount of people. Due to the efforts of people like William Wilberforce, the selling of slaves was abolished in 1807, and in 1833 the institution of slavery was abolished in the British Empire. So there was a real reaction against the slave trade, and Britain did make moves to abolish it, to end it, and also to outlaw it wherever the British Empire was. So this, especially 1833, this marked the end of the Atlantic slave trade. However, the legacy, the effect of this trade can be still felt in Africa and across the Americas. There's still a lot of problems, to take all these people and take them to another place, to destroy their culture has led to a lot of problems. Has led to a lot of problems. And it's got to be said, a lot of Britain's prosperity in the late 18th and 19th century was built on the slave trade. Places like Bristol, Liverpool, a lot of its great and grand buildings in these cities was built from money from slaves, and something we need to remind ourselves. So so that was the early stage of the building of European empires, but there was a second stage. From around 1880 until 1914, the scramble for Africa happened between the European powers. So this was all the different European powers fighting to get an empire, because basically throughout the 19th century explorers and missionaries had gone into the centre of Africa, had gone into the interior of Africa, and they had realised that there was a lot of raw materials to help the industrialised economies of Europe, to help them develop, to help them make money. There was a lot of opportunities for money making. So all the different European powers fought to get colonies in Africa. Britain wanted to create a north-south passage of British territory. Germany wanted to create an east-west passage of continuous German land. France had a lot of land in North and West Africa, places like Algeria, Côte d'Ivoire, a lot of French-speaking places now. Portugal had some large colonies, Angola and Mozambique. And Belgium, as we'll see in a minute, were given the Congo River area in Central Africa, a country that is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. That used to be the Belgian Congo. Britain had a large empire in Africa. You know, Britain's empire in Africa was obviously bigger than any of the other countries. It's included Egypt, the Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and South Africa. Even also it conquered Tanganyika from the Germans. So there was it had an enormous part of land all the way down the continent of Africa. So it's a very large empire. Now, we're going to look at the Belgian Congo, because the book we're looking at is about the Belgian Congo. Now, the British explorer, very, very famous British explorer, called Henry Morton Stanley, discovered the area now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1878. So this very, very famous British explorer discovered the Congo in that period. But King Leopold of Belgium, he got very interested in this, and so they took an interest in the area, and he was awarded the Congo River Basin in the 1884 Berlin Conference, and he called it the Congo Free State. Basically in 1884 they had a conference in Germany that sort of split up Africa among the European powers. If you look at the continent of Africa, the countries that were created, a lot of them had straight lines because they were just drawn on a map. That's been why there's been some of the problems there has been in Africa, because these weren't maybe natural countries. Countries were split across tribal lines, across religious lines, and they were told to be a country, but maybe they didn't, it wasn't, naturally where a country would have been created. Okay, so they called it the Congo Free State. King Leopold II, who was said to be a little bit crazy, ran it as his own personal state until 1908. the Belgian Parliament took it over in 1908 and made it a Belgian colony. Now, the fact was that the Congo Free State was a terrible, it was an unspeakably cruel example of European colonialism. Then the Belgians took it over directly from the Belgian Parliament, took it over from the king, but it said that they weren't much better. The Belgians were very cruel colonial rulers. There's stories of, you know, if people had to cut rubber, you know, to then transport it back to Belgium and to sell it, and if people did not cut enough rubber, they would have their hands cut off. Examples of real cruelty. You know, they were like there to exploit the people, exploit the country by whatever means necessary to make money. And it's a very, very sad fact. And basically the wars in the Congo over the last 20 years, more people, it has been the biggest land conflict since the Second World War in terms of people dying. Millions and millions of people have died. And you can say some of it, a large part of it, is the legacy, the effect that this Belgian colonialism had on the culture and the politics of Congo today. Now, we're going to look at a very great writer who wrote A Heart of Darkness, a man called Joseph Conrad, one of the great sort of writers of the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, he was a great writer in the English language, but interestingly enough, he wasn't English. He lived from 1857 until 1924. He's seen as one of the best writers in the English language, though he was actually of Polish origin and always spoke English with an accent. And I often hear students from Saudi Arabia, they think, oh, how can I get rid of my Arab accent, you know, and my Saudi accent, how can I speak English with a perfect English or perfect American accent? Well, I say, don't worry, someone like Joseph Conrad can write some of the best novels in the English language, and he still had a Polish accent, so don't worry too much, as long as you can speak good English. The accent doesn't matter too much. He became a British citizen in 1886, so he's British in that sense. He had been a sailor, and he wrote a lot about life on the sea, including two of his great novels, Lord Jim and Nostromo. He's seen as the first modernist writer. Now, in Lecture 13, next week, we're going to look at the whole movement of modernism. But Conrad was seen as one of the first modernist writers. He was also said to be prophetic. Prophetic in the sense that he saw something of the future. And he very much predicted the crumbling of the European empires. His novels are very deep, and he's very very honest about the European soul and the European psychology, but he's very much showing that it's all going to fall, these European empires. So he's said to be quite prophetic. He's said to have seen the future in what he wrote. Heart of Darkness. This is what we're going to look at. Only a very short novel, but a very great novel. It's all about the main character, a guy called Charles Marlowe, who's captaining a river, a steamboat, on the Congo River. So he's telling the story to his friends while they're sat on the Thames in London, telling his friends about this experience on the Congo River. He's searching for a man called Kurtz, an ivory hunter who is going mad in the centre of the African jungle. So it's a great novel of suspense. He's going down this river and seeing these strange things. And he's looking for a man that he doesn't know anything about, but he's hearing these rumours about how this man has gone mad and in the centre of the Congo jungle. It explores the cruelty of the Belgian colonialists. It explores European racism and ideas of civilization and savagery. You know, so where, and this is an important idea, where in the British in India were racist in the sense that they saw British people to be like this and ordered and nice and good, and Indians to be a bit mysterious and emotional, and so, you know, there was a sense of superiority and inferiority, so that the British were better than the Indians. Joseph Conrad takes that a bit further. He looks at this whole idea of black and white, you know, the fear that the white people have of black savagery, the idea that Britain is, or Europe is civilization and Africa is just wild barbarism, and looks at some of the psychology behind that. Because he's quite honest about that side of things, this novel was accused of being a racist novel by Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, a famous Nigerian writer, and he started a big debate about Heart of Darkness, you know, and which was a good debate, and he called it a very racist novel. The book was very famously turned into a film called Apocalypse Now, a very famous film, a film again that won a lot of Oscars, where he changes the setting. Instead of a trip down the Congo River, it's a trip down a river in Vietnam. And it's an excellent film, but it's based on the idea of Heart of Darkness. And the main idea in the book is of the European reaction to Africa, especially on a psychological level. So it's about how the European, especially the sort of the white European mind, copes with Africa. You know, copes with such a culture that's so different, where people look different, where people act different, where all the ideas of safety and civilization that are very important to the European minds are questioned. So that's the main theme of the book. So let's have a look at some quotes from the book. Here is one. So here is one where it's talking about the motives of the colonialists that have gone down the Congo River to the centre of Africa. So who are they? It's just saying, hunters for gold or pursuers of fame. They all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. So, you know, that's a mixture of people just bearing the sword, or, you know, the torch. You know, maybe they wanted to bring civilization, maybe they just wanted to bring, you know, the sword. Maybe they wanted to bring a spark from the sacred fire. Maybe they were missionaries trying to bring a message of some religious message. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? So this is the idea that this river is taking them to the heart of Africa, the heart of darkness, down the Congo River. The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germ of empires. You know, it's talking about the great idea of the European adventurer going into some alien and dark land, and for one reason or another, you know, creating some sort of colony. It's sort of a bit of a romantic idea, but it's also sort of questioning it a bit, you know. So this is a little bit of a romantic idea of the sort of colonial mission, but here Conrad's being much more clear. He's criticising the Belgian colonialists' drive to get resources from the Congo area, to tear treasures out of the bowels. The bowels is like the stomach of the land, was their desire, with no more moral purpose of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. He's saying, look, the Belgians, all they were doing was just robbing the people. Who paid the expenses of the noble enterprise, I don't know, but the uncle of our manager was leader of that lot. So through Charles Marlowe, a British man, they're really criticising, you know, Conrad is really criticising the Belgians' colonialist role in Africa. Now, is he also criticising all empires? It's not really clear. There is a general idea that in Africa, certainly, Britain was slightly better than other colonialists. But in a way, I think Conrad is really criticising the whole thing. There were some, you know, there are some good things that, especially the British left in certain parts of Africa, but generally the whole experience of the British Empire or European empires in Africa is seen as more negative than other places. Nope. And here, this is Conrad talking about the Belgian colonialists. And it says, these chaps were not much account really, these guys, there's not much to them. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze and nothing more, I suspect. They just wanted to take. They were conquerors. And for that you want only brute force, just the ability to commit violence. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. So this is quite, you know, Conrad is being quite heavy, you know, basically saying, look, just because we, you know, Europeans happen to have guns and the Africans didn't, you know, the Europeans could take over. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. So Conrad is really quite anti-colonialism here. Even E.M. Forster isn't as strongly anti-colonialist as Conrad is here. He's really saying that what they're doing, these men, is wrong. It's nothing to do with the European strength. It's just because of the Africans' weakness. And when you look at it, it's not a pretty thing, you know. And especially when you're just taking away the earth from people of a different complexion, different skin colour, or slightly flatter noses, you know, it's not a good thing. Now, the great thing about this novel is the psychology. It's very much about the psychology of how the Europeans view Africa, the psychological effect Africa has on the European mind. And so here's a classic bit, because if you imagine it, they're going down this river, and the things they're seeing and the things they're experiencing as they go down the river are having an effect on them psychologically. Here it says, going up that river was like travelling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. So it's like the jungle, the mystery of the jungle. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. So they're going down the river and there's this jungle on either side. The air was warm, thick, heavy, sluggish. It's like this very, there's a lot of humidity. It's oppressive to the European. There was no joy in the brilliance of the sunshine. Like when Shakespeare said, "Shall I compare you to a summer's day?" A summer's day is something wonderful and great. But here in Africa, in the Congo, the sun's brilliance is nothing. It's no joy in it. It's like, oh, this is too much. The long stretches of the waterway ran on, deserted, into the gloom of overshadowed distances. So in this alien environment, the European is scared. You know, it's scared of the environment, scared of the animals, scared of the people. Now, this is the famous, one of the most famous lines from this story, and it's also quite a sort of famous line in British literature, in English literature. It's all about where he finally finds this guy Kurtz, who's basically ended up going African. He's got involved in tribal wars, and he's got his own private army, and the natives are virtually worshipping him as some sort of god. But he's dying of some fever, and this is just before he dies. He says these things. So just before he dies, anything approaching the change that came over his features I have never seen before, and hope never to see again. So just before he dies. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent, you know, like a curtain had been broken. I saw on that ivory, that white face, the expression of sombre pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, all these different extreme emotions, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge when he'd seen himself? He cried in a whisper at some image, some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. So this is the heart of darkness. He's reached this man as, in a way, he's overcome. He's become part of this heart of darkness. And the final words of this man before he dies are the horror, the horror. Like, oh, how terrible this world is. How terrible is the savagery of Africa. How terrible is the savagery of colonialism. How horrific, how terrible it all is, you know. This is the heart of darkness. Not just in Africa, but in the heart of the European. It's a very deep novel on a psychological level, and it's very much exposing where there's this idea of civilization and savagery. Really, what it's saying is that the civilization is very savage. It's just as savage as the savagery, because the Belgians were very savage and barbaric rulers. And maybe he's saying that all the colonialists were. You know, maybe he's saying that the Belgians were worse than others. It's not clear. Okay, so we've got some questions all about these two lectures that have been on the subject of the British Empire and how the British Empire obviously affected the world. You know, it's very, very important. But also you've got to realise that the Britain's colonial sort of history has affected Britain, affected the way Britain sees itself, and also affected mainland Britain now, because you'll always find vast amounts of immigrants from the colonies that have influenced British culture in many, many ways. Okay, this is the 6th assignment. We've got 5 questions. Number 1, the rule of the East India Company became the British Raj after which event? And you've got 3 options. The woman that accuses Dr. Aziz in a passage to India is called, and you've got 3 options. The British Raj was an what part of the British Empire? Number 4, another name for the scramble for Africa could be, and you've got 3 options there. And Heart of Darkness talks about the psychological effects of the clash between civilization and you've got 3 options. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's the end of the of lecture 12, and it's the end of our 2-part series on the British Empire and some of the literature surrounding the British Empire. I hope it's I've given a fair account of the positive and the negative side of the empire, but I've also hope I've given you some understanding of my view of this experience in British history from the perspective of a British man. Okay, thank you very much, and see you next week. Okay.